How was your weekend, Larry?
Well, my trailer is a damn mess. As I was mowing the lawn, I came across something interesting. Something that you might want to talk about in the next episode.
Really, Larry? Was it a UFO?
Something like that.
Well, tell me.
It's gonna spoil the moment.
Come on, man. Jeez, it's gonna bother me now.
Nope, I'll tell you next week.
Why?
'Cause I said so.
Larry, come on, because then I'm gonna feel bothered and I can't do this episode. No, I'm serious, dude. I can't.
You'll be fine.
Why? I'm dying to know I can't do this week's episode.
Alright, I'll tell you at the end of this episode.
Deal. Oh, hi, everybody!
¿Cómo estás?
I'm going to talk to you about two very scary stories that happened in the 1970s to early 1990s.
It's gonna be
The Sallie House and Bobby Mackeys. The Sallie House, located in Atchison, Kansas, is one of the most terrifying haunted places located in the United States. Here's a detailed account of the most famous haunting case associated with the Pickman family during the early 1990s. Before delving into the Pickman family's experience, it's important to understand the history of the house. The house was built in the mid-1800s, as its legend was tragically tied to a young girl by the name of Sally who died in the house. According to the local lore, there was a doctor that lived in the house in the early 1900s, and he used part of it as his office. One day, a frantic mother rushed her daughter into the doctor's office after her daughter was experiencing severe abdominal pain, which was originally thought to be appendicitis. Sally died on the operating table, which allowed her spirit to remain in the house. This legend set the stage for a haunting that would take place over a century later. In 1993, Tony and Deborah Pickman, expecting their first child, moved into the house. It was a cozy home, perfect for starting a family, and they were excited about their future. However, it wouldn't be long before their lives were turned upside down by the unexplainable, terrifying encounters. The activity began innocently enough, small strange occurrences that could easily be dismissed. Lights flickered, objects seemed to move slightly, and cold spots started to appear around the house. And Tony and Deborah were mildly disturbed, but not overly concerned. However, when they began to hear strange noises in the middle of the night, footsteps, knocks, and the sound of furniture moving, they started to wonder if something was amiss. Soon after, the Pickmans started to notice odd things that allowed them to suspect that there was a childlike presence that was in the house. Toys that would be put away would suddenly be found scattered across the floor. Months later, after Tony and Deborah had their first child, they had a weird encounter. When Tony, Deborah, and her sister Karen went into the nursery room to check on their baby, they noticed that the stuffed animals were laid perfectly on the floor in a circle, centered. Thinking it was a prank, they all interrogated each other, and none of them reported that they did it as a prank. Pictures of children would fall from the walls, and stuffed animals would be moved to different parts of the house. The couple initially thought this was Sally, the spirit of a young girl that was playfully interacting with them. Deborah in particular felt very strange empathy for the spirit, believing that Sally meant no harm. However, Tony felt differently. He started experiencing phenomena that was directly aimed at him. He frequently woke up with scratches and bruises on his body, not remembering how they got there. The scratches were particularly chilling as it was lined up by 3 parallel lines, which is usually a sign of a demonic presence that mocks the Holy Trinity. At first, Tony thought that the 3 scratch marks that was on his body was him accidentally scratching himself in his sleep, until his wife, Deborah, saw right in front of her the formation of the scratches on his back. After this, the paranormal activity in the house got so worse, and everything was just going on. Objects were flying across the room, stuff was breaking, and there was unexplainable fires that was forming in parts of the house. It just got very dangerous. Tony was targeted by this entity, and it just got far more worse. He often felt like he was being pushed or shoved by some unseen force. Deborah also claimed to see a vision of Sally's angry face burned into the fireplace of their living room. At this point, Tony and Deborah are desperate for answers, so they reach out a famous paranormal group. One of the most well-known teams was the Sightings television crew, and they documented the haunted parts of the house. Now, these paranormal groups would be psychic mediums and ghost hunters. During the investigation, multiple strange encounters were captured on camera and audio. There were shadowy figures, doors that were slamming, opening, and closing, and also an electronic voice phenomenon of an EVP of a little girl that said, "Mommy." Now, during the investigation, there was some stuff that was captured on camera and audio. There was disembodied voices of a child that said, "Mommy." There were doors in the house that were shutting and closing, and there was also shadowy figures that were being seen on camera walking and disappearing. Now, a sidekick that was exploring the house claimed that Sally wasn't the only spirit that was haunting the house. It was also a malevolent entity that was also with the house. Now, when the medium was done exploring the house, she later confirmed with the Pickman family that Sally was trapped and controlled by this other evil entity spirit, which explained the violent attacks on Tony. This theory seemed to align with the intensity of the haunting. One of the most frightening encounters in the house was when Tony experienced a frightening demonic entity walking in the house. Tony described the entity as having a twisted face and a body of a man with deep, hollow black eyes. After this occurrence, Tony's health and mental state started to decline rapidly. He became constantly withdrawn, feeling that this entity was watching him. It was just a sense of paranoia. He suffered from severe nightmares, and he would wake up in the middle of the night with a cold sweat and feeling an intense presence that was in the room, scaring him to death. He just wasn't able to sleep very well. He had very bad insomnia. But this wasn't all, as he had another terrifying encounter in the kitchen. One day, Tony was thirsty, so he decided to grab a glass of orange juice in the kitchen. When he opened up the refrigerator door and closed it, there was an apparition of a little girl dressed in an early 1900s dress staring right back at him. Immediately, Tony froze. Now, when he recuperated, he ended up drawing this exact image of what he saw of the little girl. So what do you think? How scary is this image? Does it look adorable, or does it look scary?
Man, that's bullshit. If that ghost is that cocky to draw 3 lines on somebody's back and call it Picasso, then I'm gonna beat the crap out of it.
Well, you gotta understand, Larry, that this is something invisible and much more powerful.
So what'd they do?
Well, the haunting took a significant emotional and psychological toll on the Pickman family. After years of torment and torture and stress, the Pickmans decided, screw this, we're moving out, we've had enough. Our baby almost got hurt, we're seeing these evil spirits that's affecting us and we can't even see them. We're calling the power of Christ, and it's just as powerful as it can be. So we're done. They left the Sally house for good, but the experiences stayed with them to this day. Tony claims that he still experiences paranormal activity. Now, whatever was in the Sally house ended up following them into their new home. Meanwhile, over 30 years have passed, and the Sally home is known for its tourist attraction and paranormal investigation. Many people who visit the house report unexplained cold spots and objects moving back and forth without any explanation, stuff falling and breaking, and whispers and disembodied voices. Some investigators even reported that they've been pushed and shoved and scratched by some unseen force. The legend of Sally continues to grow, and the Sally house is regarded as one of the most haunted locations in America. Despite numerous investigations and mediums that have explored the house, there's just still an unexplained explanation for why these paranormal encounters are happening. But the question is Sally really to blame? Really, there's more of a direct encounter that this is a much more malevolent entity than a little girl. It is a demonic entity, especially the 3 scratches that have been seen on Tony and on paranormal investigators in the house. But again, other people also regard that Sally's energy is just a residual energy that is in the house. It's not a conscious energy, it's just a replay of a recording that happened a long time ago. So really, people have claimed that Sally is just a residual energy that's in the house. All it was just a little girl that died in the house very tragically, and that her energy still remains in the house to this day. Whether it's the spirit of Sally or this demonic entity force that is said to encompass the house, it leaves one question. And this is the next story that I'm about to ask you all. But what place is known for its wickedness and demonic entities that thrive on the living? A place located in Wilder, Kentucky.
Well, boy, my hometown. I'm gonna need a studlight for this one.
It's called Bobby Mackeys Music World. Built in the 1850s, the building served as a slaughterhouse and meat packing plant. The gruesome start laid the foundation for a dark and violent history. A well was dug in the basement to collect the blood and waste from the slaughtered animals, which later became known as the portal to hell, a central point to many of the paranormal stories tied to this location. In the late 19th century, the slaughterhouse was closed down and remained abandoned for years. However, the location gained notoriety in the early 20th century when rumors of the occult activity had surfaced. Local legend claims that the basement served as a site for satanic rituals, animal sacrifices, and occult ceremonies, further changing the location to bad energy. One of the most well-known tragedies associated with Bobby Mackeys was the murder of a woman by the name of Pearl Bryan, who was a 22-year-old woman who had come from a wealthy family from Greencastle, Indiana. In 1896, Pearl was lured in northern Kentucky by her lover Scott Jackson, a dental student who had gotten her pregnant. Unwilling to face the consequences of an unplanned pregnancy, Jackson and his friend Alonzo Whaling decided to perform an abortion on Pearl Bryan. When the procedure went wrong, they decided to kill her to cover up their crime. Pearl's decapitated body was found in a field less than 2 miles away from where Bobby Mackeys would later on be built. Her head was never found. Some speculated that her head was thrown in the well as a ritual. Both Jackson and Alonzo were convicted of this crime and they were sentenced death by hanging. According to the legend, before Walling was executed, he vowed to return after death to haunt the area. After the murder of Pearl Bryan, the slaughterhouse was demolished, and it was then that Bobby Mackeys would be built on the same site. During the 1920s, the building was an illegal speakeasy during the age of prohibition, of gambling and drinking. During that time, the mob had ties to the area, where numerous crimes were believed to have happened. Bodies were allegedly disposed of in the well, adding to the dark energy surrounding the location. In the 1950s, the building was then transformed into a club called the Latin Quarter. The club became known as a place for gambling and illegal prostitution, and tragedy struck when a dancer by the name of Johanna had taken her own life downstairs in the basement near the well. According to the legend, Johanna was the daughter of the club's owner who had fallen in love with a man who was a singer and performed there. When the father discovered the relationship, he ordered the man's murder. Distraught by the loss of her lover, Johanna ended up poisoning herself, and she was found dead in the basement. And again, another girl that was 5.5 months pregnant, and her spirit is believed to haunt the site to this day. Then in 1978, Bobby Mackey ended up taking ownership of the building, and he transformed it and called it Bobby Mackeys, which was a country bar. And he was very blindsided to the paranormal activity that would happen at the bar experienced by guests and employees. He was just unaware of the bloody history behind it. People claim to hear unheard voices, stuff falling, chairs moving around, and also a feeling of a pair of hands grabbing them. There was also a smell of rotting flesh that would emanate in the basement near the well. But every time there were people that went downstairs where this well was, they always reported an uneasy feeling downstairs. And this led the nickname for the well to be called the Portal of Hell. People believed that this is where the demonic entities would linger and that they would be trapped in the well. Now, Bobby Mackey's wife, Janet, was at first very skeptical of the place being haunted, and also the evaluation that this place had a very bloody history. She didn't believe in ghosts, and she thought it was all BS. But the skepticism didn't last long, as she had an encounter in the basement. On one particular day, Janet decided to go into the basement by herself, where all of a sudden she felt a sense of dread encompass her, along with a heaviness that was in the air. She felt like somebody was watching her. Suddenly, as she approached the well, she was pushed by some unseen force. She described the sensation as being shoved too hard. As she scrambled to get up, she heard a very deep, menacing voice that said, "Get out." And this voice was so powerful that it filled the air, and this terrified her. Panicked and terrified, Janet left the basement. From that point on, she refused to go back into the basement, and it left her a terrifying mark. And that's when she became more cautious of the haunted reputation that was in the bar. After that experience, she wanted to leave, but because of her husband being so into the business, she decided to just put up with the paranormal BS. Another force had pushed her down the steps while she was pregnant. Being found on the floor in pain and bruised up, she was taken to the hospital in fear of the baby being injured. Luckily, it wasn't. Another former employee by the name of Carl Lawson, who worked for Bobby Mackeys during that time, reported strange encounters that would happen at Bobby Mackeys in the basement. One night during severe weather, the power had gone out, and Carl wanted to go downstairs to revive the power. As he approached the steps, he ended up going onto the breaker, turning it on and off, but there was no power. Realizing that he can't turn the power on, Carl had seen strikes of lightning hit the basement. During those strikes of lightning, he had seen two mysterious apparitions of two men wearing suits, staring right at him. Later, he believed that the two mysterious men that were in the basement was the late Scott Jackson and Alonzo Whaling. Immediately, he ran up the steps. Soon after, another story involved a police officer being called at the site for a possible break-in. When he parked his cop car outside the building, he noticed that there was a shadowy figure that was walking in between the dark windows. The officer quickly went into the building with a flashlight. When he went in, he heard a man and a woman talking with jazz music playing in the background. Hearing this from one of the doorways, he enters in only to hear that it stopped. The cop became confused, only realizing that what he just heard had stopped. It was then that he believed that ghosts do exist. Then, a couple weeks after that, there was a fatal car accident that happened right in front of Bobby Mackeys. When trying to find a blanket to cover up the bodies, a mysterious woman had appeared out of nowhere, and she had given them a blanket to cover up the bodies. Seeing that this woman was going inside of Bobby Mackeys, they believed that she was one of the waitresses. Hours after the accident had cleared up, the officers wanted to go inside Bobby Mackeys to thank the woman for giving them a blanket. When trying to open up the door, they realized that the door was locked. They shined their flashlights in the windows, only to realize that there was nobody there. The next morning, the officers decided to personally talk to Bobby Mackey about this incident, and that this mysterious woman that the officers had mentioned had not matched the description of one of his employees. Meanwhile, Carl Lawson was tormented by these spirits. He was possessed. It was just enough for Carl and Janet to call a sidekick by the name of Patricia Michelle. Months later, Patricia had arrived at Bobby Mackey's, and she had warned Carl and Janet to not tell her specifically about the history of the building, as she wanted to find out through her natural medium abilities on the history of the area and what spirits were haunting the place. Sure enough, Patricia was able to match her psychic abilities with actual facts that had happened years before. Patricia reported that there was indeed a woman by the name of Johanna that killed herself in the basement. When Patricia told her that she could send her into the light, the spirit of Johanna replied, "No, lady, I'd like to stay here." This made Patricia aware that she was afraid to face judgment. Patricia also sensed that there was a woman's headless body floating in the well. Soon after, Carl Lawson was possessed by the spirits that inhabited Bobby Mackey's. They ended up doing an exorcism on Carl, and they noticed that he was speaking in tongues and speaking words that were backwards. So Bobby Mackey's was demolished in March of 2024, a couple months ago, but the site remains, and Carl Lawson sadly died in 2012. Anyhow, Larry, what was it that you found on your lawn this past weekend?
Well, when I mowed the lawn, I came across something silver. Something almost like a saucer-looking thing. A can of sardines that I had eaten this past weekend.
You suck, bro. That was it?
Yeah.
Hopefully you enjoyed this week's episode, and tell me, what do you think is the most scariest story in this week's episode? Was it the Sally house or Bobby Mackey's? You decide. Have a great week, everybody. Like and subscribe.
An empty can of sardines that I had eaten this past weekend.